academic freedom, academic integrity, academic misconduct, research integrity, research misconduct, rights, responsibilities. These words, these phrases seem pretty simple, seem pretty clear, and in international higher education, they've almost reached the level of cliche. The problem is, though, that very senior and very experienced academics have been brought down by these phrases and brought down in public. Hashtag no pressure. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University, and it's my pleasure and my responsibility to guide you through this research integrity mandatory training. So in this training we have 4 parts, or 4 goals if you like. Firstly, we're going to investigate the relationship or not between research integrity and academic integrity. The second stop of the day involves us exploring the 2018 Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. The third nuggety section explores the very nature of authorship and how it operates in relation to collusion and plagiarism. And we finish off with the really frightening part. We explore the nature of the investigations, how the investigations take place when a research misconduct complaint emerges. Thank you so much for joining me today. I wish you well. Welcome to Part 1. Investigating the differences between research integrity and research misconduct and academic misconduct. Academic freedom is founded on and by a community of scholars who share rights and responsibilities. Historically, the phrase academic freedom emerged by the end of the 19th century, when university academics were not only required to teach, but to publish original research. Academic freedom is shaped by the rights and the responsibilities of research integrity and academic integrity. And certainly there is a relationship between academic integrity and research integrity, academic misconduct and research misconduct. The Australian Research Council focuses on research integrity and misconduct, and their goal is to safeguard the confidence in publicly funded research, valuing peer review, grant selection processes and evaluation protocols. They are charged with the maintenance of research standards. An integrity breach, research or academic, is a deviation from agreed principles. For example, at Columbia University, academic integrity and the responsible conduct of research is all aligned within a single policy, focusing on proper citation and paraphrasing. In Australia, these policies certainly align, but they are distinct. Academic integrity respects authorship, citation practices, and acknowledgement of our work, but also the work of others. Academic misconduct locates plagiarism, collusion, or fabrication. Research integrity refers to the professional and ethical conduct of research, so that means ethics clearances are in place. A recognition of the research from others is determined and confirmed by citation. But also we see a respect for authorship and for all of those who contribute to research. Research misconduct, like academic misconduct, is serious. Yep. It locates the fabrication of data sets, breaches in ethics clearances, or a discovery of a lack of ethics clearances, including authors on a publication that had not reached the threshold of authorship, or excluding authors who had reached that threshold of authorship. Academic misconduct and research misconduct capture fabrication, plagiarism, fraud, deception, or falsification, but it also captures a mismanagement of conflicts of interest, including, for example, the selection of examiners in higher degree students. In Australia, there was a major national policy intervention in 2018 that really separated these terms, that really separated academic integrity and research integrity. In 2018, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research was released. It was a revision of the previous code, so therefore let's move to our second session of this training to understand the 2018 Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, but also the requirements of authorship. Part 2, understanding the 2018 Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research and the requirements of authorship. The 2018 Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research set out broad principles confirming an honest, ethical and conscientious research culture. And this research culture is being created, obviously, for our researchers and our students, but also higher education institutions. All national funding, including from the NHMRC, must adhere to this code. So therefore, this code is important for research training. If you want to supervise higher degree students, part of your responsibility is to educate your students in the code. By December 2019, the NHMRC, the ARC and Universities Australia released a document titled, quote, Supervision, a guide supporting the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, end of quote. It is a powerful, freely available document. All the excuses are over. There's no courtesy authorship. There is no, this is the way it's always been done in my discipline, therefore you need to add my name to that article. All this stuff is gone. These unjust practices are now in breach of the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. The new code maintains very clear instructions for authorship, very clear requirements for what is necessary to be an author. The guidelines are ruthlessly clear. Let me, for example, read to you item 6 from the 2019 Supervisor's Guide. Quote, examples of breaches of the code are related to supervision and include, but are not limited to, failure by a supervisor to provide adequate guidance or mentorship on the responsible conduct of research to researchers or researcher trainees under their supervision, or demanding or accepting authorship of a research output on the basis of supervision, where the individual does not also satisfy the authorship criteria in the authorship guide. End of quote. Most of us, through our academic lives around the world, have seen some dreadful behaviour around academic authorship. But Australia now has powerful and strong guidelines, and ensuring that we now must abide by the code and that we must teach our higher degree students about the code. That is now mandatory in research training and researcher training. Part 3. Authorship, plagiarism and collusion. Higher degree students in our universities are our most inexperienced researchers. They hold very little power and they certainly can be exploited. And that's why the ARC, Universities Australia and the NHMRC are so focused on supervision and authorship, particularly in this new iteration of the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. Let me give you an example of how PhD students can be exploited. In my first meeting with my PhD supervisor, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, he stated that whatever I wrote during that PhD, he would gain authorship on it because he was my supervisor. Now, I laughed at him. I was a young woman, but wow, I laughed at him. Because I arrived at the university with a fully realised project. I brought my own funding. I'd already completed a research master's degree. The supervisor didn't read a word of the text and didn't complete any of the data collection or analysis. He had nothing to do with the project. So, at its most basic, just because any of us supervise a higher degree, that has nothing to do with authorship. Nothing. In fact, the inverse is true. All authors must prove their authorship by a set of criteria. Let's talk about that criteria. Authors must contribute to 2 of the following 3 variables to be an author. 1. Research design. 2. Data collection and analysis. 3. Substantive writing and drafting. 2 of those 3. These verification protocols are important between academic colleagues, but also between you and your students. It is important that these discussions emerge early in a higher degree candidature or at the very foundational stage of a research project. These agreements must be handled with decency and transparency and respect. Remember that in the Australian system, the higher degree students own their intellectual property unless they sign it away. And these contracts need to be signed by the student really early on, particularly if there are industry partnerships or alternative IP collaborations in place. Without this contract, without this agreement, students own their IP. There are plenty of assumptions about authorship, particularly when it's tethered to research supervision. But assumptions are not enough. Assumptions may be, and often are, in breach of this research code. So in response to this research code, academic integrity and academic misconduct is also transforming. So, for example, can plagiarism emerge during a PhD candidature? Interesting question. What is the status of a draft between a student and a supervisor? Can or should a supervisor report a student for one of these weekly drafts? Now, obviously, if an examiner finds plagiarism in a thesis, then serious and formal procedures commence immediately. But it is important to be clear on how academic misconduct floats through a PhD candidature. Can, for example, a draft exchanged between a supervisor and a student be an example of academic misconduct? Hard to tell, and that's because of the troubling status of these drafts. So is a draft exchanged between a student and a supervisor actually submitted or accessible work? Well, universities around the world started to get themselves into trouble because what would happen was a supervisor who didn't like their student very much cried plagiarism on a minor draft and then remove the student from their supervisory group. So it gets really messy. Now, clearly the final thesis is accessible, but are the weekly drafts exchanged between supervisors and students? So what we've done now at Charles Darwin University is to intensify the importance of the milestones each year. And we ensure that every single student uses text matching software, uses Authenticate, and it is available for every single student to use. It's available, it's free. And at the very least, Once a year, during a milestone, a student must put a piece of work through Authenticate, and that report is then evaluated by supervisors and independent assessors. So Authenticate in a milestone is used as a diagnostic tool to teach students about reading, about note-taking, about paraphrasing, about plagiarism, about academic integrity and its relationship with research integrity. All of this builds transparency so that academics and students can discuss and verify rigour. What does rigour mean? But also the intellectual level of scholarship. But of course, academic integrity and academic misconduct is a lot more than plagiarism. Collusion, although part of the academic misconduct suite, is very rare in doctoral education. It involves working together on a submission which was meant to be the result of individual work. Now, where all of this may have a bearing on our research culture is we need to make sure that any published work in a doctoral program is considered in relation to the co-authorship of articles that are part of the thesis. It must be the student's work. The examiner must be assessing the student's work. Therefore, all CDU students and all CDU supervisors sign off authorship contributions to articles. Every single author must sign off their role in authorship in terms of research design, data collection and analysis, and writing up the research through substantive editing and drafting. Research is a privilege. And because it is a privilege, it is undergirded by rights and responsibilities. Australia has a clear code for the responsible conduct of research. And this code, as we are doing with you today, is taught to academics and to our students. There are consequences for a breach in the code, and these breaches can be reported to CDU by any member of the community, and each report is investigated with utmost seriousness. Therefore, we move to the final section of our training, investigations of a breach in research integrity. Part 4. Investigations into a breach of research integrity. This is our final part, and thank you so much for joining me on this journey. But it's a serious ending. Investigations into a breach of research integrity. If authorship is mishandled, then researchers are opening themselves to claims of unethical conduct and being in breach of the code. I will now tell you the process that occurs if anyone, and that includes our students, believe there has been a breach of the code. They write to the Research Integrity Officer at CDU with their complaint, one email. And I'm going to go through this process now so that you see the seriousness and the scale of the work for members of the university community in response to the breach. So, a breach is reported, and it must identify specific details and include evidence to enable the potential breach to be assessed. All of us as researchers have an obligation to report information about potential breaches, and all complaints must be honest. Malicious complaints may move to other university policies. So these complaints are confidential, except if there is legal action in place, and procedural fairness may require the identity of the complainant to be revealed. Anonymous reports will be investigated, but sufficient information must be available to investigate the complaint. Information about the breach is passed on to the designated officer, the DO, who assesses if there is a case to answer. If there is a case to answer, then the designated officer then passes all the information they've gathered so far to an assessment officer, an AO. The assessment officer gathers information on the case from all parties, deploys text matching software if possible, assesses if the complaint would constitute a breach, and all of this is an evidentially driven process. This preliminary assessment must be completed as quickly as possible and certainly within 40 working days, but of course other matters do interfere with that. But a timely investigation is important for all parties. The assessment officer informs the designated officer of this preliminary assessment based on evidence and within the balance of probabilities. A recommendation is offered from the following three options. There is a case to answer. It is referred to other institutional processes, for example, such as bullying complaints or a staff code of conduct or sexual assault, sexual harassment, or the complaint can be dismissed. The designated officer informs the respondent of the outcomes of the preliminary assessment. If there is a case to answer, the designated officer then implements the next stage of the process. They ascertain if the complaint can be resolved locally with a consensual outcome. They refer the case to investigation. They refer the case to other institutional processes, such as bullying or harassment procedures, or the complaint is dismissed. If the designated officer recommends a further investigation, then the responsible executive officer, the REO, that's often the Vice-Chancellor or a Deputy Vice-Chancellor, appoints an investigation panel. And this panel almost always reports to the VC or one of the Deputy Vice-Chancellors. The investigation panel can determine the following outcomes. They can locate a breach of the code. They can locate no breach of the code. If no breach in the code is determined, the allegation is either dismissed or again referred to other institutional processes. The determination and recommendations of actions that follow the investigation from the responsible executive officer result in corrective actions being implemented, including retraction of a publication or correction of the public record, such as the addition or the removal of authors, or disciplinary action under employment agreements, policies and procedures. A review of this investigation on the grounds of procedural fairness can be requested by any party, and in the Northern Territory, that can involve ICAC. I've given you this narrative not to frighten you, but to explain what happens in response to every single complaint about research integrity at CDU. This pretty scary process can be avoided if we are clear and overt about our discussions of research and authorship. I know all of this is a tough conversation. The penalties are harsh. And the nostalgic cliche of when I did my PhD or this is how it's done in my discipline no longer matter. This code is national. This code applies to all disciplines, all academic staff, and all higher degree students. Ignorance is not an option. So please make sure for every article, every book chapter, every book, every research output you produce, you contribute to two of the following three elements of research: research design, data collection and analysis, substantive writing and editing. Only then can the privilege of research, the privilege of producing a publication, be anchored to the responsibilities of scholarship. Thank you for your time.